I jump with you straight to chapter 21 because I want to remind you back to why we were talking about macromolecules and enzymes and chemistry, um, how all these things keep us alive. And this is nutrition and digestion. And I want to try to make connections like that throughout this class to help you try to see how some of these things go together, because everything in biology goes together at some point. And most of the time, you don't actually figure this out until a couple of years in. Um, but I'd like for you to kind of see some of these connections now. One of these connections is what I'm trying to show you now is nutrition is related to the macromolecules we just talked about. Um, so all of these things have to do with food, and the macromolecules we talked about. You see them all over this table, right? Um, you see the greenery in here. There's cellulose in there for sure. There's carbohydrates in these cookies. Carbohydrates here. Lots of carbohydrates, lots of sugars in here. This is fish, lobster. So there's going to be some protein inside of there. This is rice, so carbohydrates. Um, this is hummus, so there's going to be some fats that are going to be in there. Um, but what do we do with the food, right? We digest our food, we ingest the food somehow, and then somehow it becomes possible for us to utilize this. And so the big ideas, the big things that we're going to cover is how animals, different creatures obtain food and how they process it. The human digestive system, because we are very human centric in everything we do. So obviously, the same thing is gonna be true for the digestive system. And then we're going to talk about nutrition. Um, and nutrition, we're actually going to talk a little bit not just about humans, because we can learn from the difference in the digestive systems. We can learn different needs for nutrition. But let's talk about obtaining and processing food first. So we group animals by what they eat, right? By animal diets themselves. These animal diets vary obviously extensively. We've got herbivores; those are the plant eaters. Um, Carnivores, those are the meat eaters, and omnivores, they eat a little bit of everything. Then the way animals eat also is different. So there are suspension feeders, substrate feeders, fluid feeders, and bulk feeders. And the easiest thing to do is to just use an examples for this. So this is an example of a suspension feeder. It strains food. This manta ray strains food from the seawater. This is an example of a substrate feeder. So this caterpillar eats its way through the tissues. This is an example of a fluid feeder. It's a mosquito sucking blood. And this is an example of a bulk feeder, which is a gray heron that is feeding a fish. And every animal somehow has to ingest food, digest it somehow. Every creature somehow has to then utilize the food somehow, right? Um, and so the way we look at digestion, we look at it in four stages: ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. So when you're looking at this, how this is happening as it's going through our bodies. Ingestion, you've got this mechanical digestion that's happening here, which is basically chewing, right? Then you've got the pieces of food. Then comes the digestion, which is the breakdown in different phases. Then absorption, where the small molecules enter the body. and elimination of undigested materials. Um, we need to do this process because our body can't do anything with the big pieces of food. In order for them to get to where they need to go, they need to be broken down in their component parts. And just as a little reminder, we just talked about what the molecules were, the macromolecules, and what they were made up of. So we've got proteins, and there are enzymes that break them down into amino acids. We've got the polysaccharides or disaccharides or oligosaccharides, and specific enzymes break them down into monosaccharides, nucleic acids broken down into nucleotides, fat broken down into the component parts. Um, so proteins, when you're taken on proteins, they all are taken down in their component parts. So it doesn't really matter what kind of proteins. The only thing it matters for is the collection of amino acids that you end up with. Um, Digestion happens in specialized compartments. Now, that's not a bad idea, right? Because if you are what you eat, then all the structures in your body are also structures that the digestive enzymes inside of your body can digest. So you got to make sure that you keep strict control of these digestive enzymes, right? And so digestive enzymes are tightly controlled. So they're coming from specific cells. Um, Maybe they're only active in certain environments. And even from very small, even when we're looking at bacteria, you'll find that the digestion happens in specialized compartments, like in little lysosomes. Um, Earlier creatures have just one cavity. So they eat, things go in, and then they go out the same place again. Um, but the idea of the absorption and digestion is actually very similar. In this case, it all happens in the same compartment. So you've got digestive juices that are being released from a cell, foods digested, and then different specialized cells take up the particles, and then they bring the food vacuoles, take them to where they need to go. Um, this is a very simple organism. Um, as you go up the evolutionary chain, um, different types of digestions have developed, where it a lot of it has to do with what these creatures actually eat. Like birds, for example, they have a need for a crop. Um, because they have all these they have a need for breaking down hard things. Similarly to the grasshopper, um, those are all very specialized type um, um, digestive systems. But the one that we really care about is the human digestive system, right? um, so these are basically the parts of the digestive system. On the left, the things written in black. And this is one of the things when you're looking at pictures, and I can't point this out enough. Make sure you look at the pictures in your biology book, and make sure that you look at them in detail. Nothing in those pictures is done by accident. So on the left hand side, you see that things are written in black. On the right hand side, they're written in blue. So on the left, these are all part of the alimentary canal, whereas these on the right hand side are the accessory organs. So, things like that, you can grab these things out of the pictures. But if you're starting from and there's one assignment I'm going to have you do later on where I'm going to ask you to basically follow down a spoonful of sugar down all the way to the powerhouse of the cell, which is the mitochondrium. And so it starts out in your oral cavity, um, and then gets taken down into the esophagus, um, and then takes the journey um, into the stomach through the small intestines, and then this is where the division happens between the things that are needed and the things that aren't, and then they go to different places. Um, but let's look at this the esophagus real quick, or look at the throat as a whole. There's two parts that go down there, and I want to point out, just because I don't know how much and when we're going to do the fetal pig in Bio 113. When you do the fetal pig, make sure you look at the difference between the esophagus and the trachea, because they have very different functions, and because they have very different functions, um, they're very different structures. So this is one of the things. This form follows function. These structure and function things that go together. The trachea is part of the windpipe. It's part of the respiratory system, which is a system that relies on a vacuum. And because of that, the trachea has cartilage rings that keep it open. The esophagus, on the other hand, um, is a tube that moves food down a tube by contraction. So it has to basically be muscular, right? It has to be contractible. Um, the secondary problem we've got when we swallow, um, in our throat, there's two tubes that go down, right? One is the windpipe, and you should never get food in the windpipe. And the other one is the esophagus. And it's probably not the best idea to swallow all that much air. But this is relatively tightly controlled. So anytime a bolus of food comes down, the epiglottis automatically closes down the windpipe, um, and makes sure that the swallowing reflex here is instituted, so that the food bolus goes down. Um, the initial um, trigger for swallowing is a voluntary reflex, but down here is actually an involuntary reflex. And if you watch sometimes people who like swallow like whole potatoes or fish or whatever, there's people who do that. These they're regurgitators, and they, anytime anything particulate um hits your epiglottis, it'll immediately shut down, and it automatically, the swallow reflex automatically gets instituted. um I mean, I wouldn't try it out, right? Make sure 911 is on standby when you do these kinds of things. But at any rate, so the bolus of food goes down, muscles are squeezing this thing down. So it's a contraction that moves it down into the stomach. And here I want to just, the Heimlich maneuver basically reverses this, right? So if something gets stuck somewhere, in here where it won't go any further, and it blocks things so you can't breathe, what happens is, by making the Heimlich maneuver, you're pushing up the diaphragm, and you're pushing air, um, basically the reverse direction, hopefully dislodging the food in the process. Um, but then, so food goes in the stomach, and in the stomach is where a lot of that digestion happens. And where I told you earlier there, that the body is very careful with digestive enzymes. What happens in the stomach? In the stomach, we have a very high concentration of hydrochloric acid, and the digestive enzyme um, is actually um, is actually produced as a as an inactive enzyme that is only, so as pepsinogen, and it's only activated in the presence of hydrochloric acid. So this thing is can be made wherever it's made, but it's not active unless it's in the stomach. So because it's only active in this highly acidic environment. Um, and this is in part to make sure that you don't digest yourself elsewhere, right? Um, there are specific cells, um, parietal cells, that produce the hydrochloric acid, and they have very specific forms and the way they look. And this is one of those things. Again, forms follows function. We're gonna encounter this multiple times. Um, One of the things that people often talk about is then diseases of the stomach, and one of those fascinating story is the story is the story of Heliobacter pylori. We used to think that ulcers were actually something that was caused by stress. But actually, during my lifetime, they figured out that that was not the case. There was actually Heliobacter pylori that does this. Um, then in the small intestines is when things get when where the chemical digestion continues, and then where the major part of the nutrient absorption happens. This is where also the helpers come in, right? So the gallbladder and the liver, they work together producing bile, which is going to be put into the small intestines, and it's going to help with the digestion of fats. Um, Pancreatic juices are also helping with the digestion. Of all the things in the of the chyme that comes out of the stomach. Um, Different enzymes, again, enzymes are very specialized, and different enzymes do different things here. Um, so pancreatic amylases break down the polysaccharides. Trypsin and chymotrypsin break down the polypeptides. Nucleases break down RNA and DNA. Bile salts help with fat digestion. Once all of those things are broken down, we then need to take the ones that are useful, the nutrients that are useful, and we need to be able to take those up, right? And this absorption happens primarily in um, in the intestinal wall. Um, Anytime you have something that in order to increase absorption, because most of absorption happens via diffusion, um, and anytime something happens via diffusion, it helps to have a greater surface area, which is what you see here. This is just simply an enlargement of the surface area, because you have these villi and then you have the microvilli, and it's like, smaller and smaller little, every little surface that can be expanded is expanded a little more. Um, and there's blood capillaries that run directly underneath of there. And so what happens is that as the nutrients flow across there, there's a lower concentration of the nutrients inside of here. So the nutrients are just passively, through diffusion, absorbed as amino acids and sugars that go straight into the blood, or as fatty acids and glycerol, where they're more likely to go into the lymph. Um, Now, the blood supply there, there's a blood supply. It's called the mesenteric artery and the mesenteric bed that surrounds your entire small intestine. And from this, and this is what's the blue stuff right here. It's this tight network of tiny little blood vessels that surrounds your entire intestines, and those they collect all of those nutrients, all of those things, and send it into the hepatic portal vein to the liver, where then it's going to be detoxified, It's going to be some of the glucose is going to be stored there. And from there, it's going to then be um, transported towards the heart, and then to the rest of the body. Um, Now, the things that aren't nutrients need to leave now, right? And this is where the large intestines come in. So the large intestines then are primarily involved in reabsorption of the liquid, because we don't want to lose as much water. We want to lose as little water as possible. Um, and then everything that doesn't can't be reabsorbed back is then expelled through the anus. Um, the appendix here, we used to think the appendix had no role. I think the most recent idea is the appendix does, in fact, have a role, um, maybe as part of the immune system. I think that's the most recent discussion that we had. Um, Now, the length of the digestive tract um, tends to correlate with diet. This is another one of those form following function kinds of things. Um, Herbivores tend to have longer alimentary canals, and then they have compartments that house microbes that help them digest the cellulose. This would be a carnivore, has a relatively small, relatively short digestive system and a relatively small cecum. And then you've got the koala, which is an herbivore, which is where the whole thing is just a whole lot longer. Um, and it's, if you're more efficient at getting nutrients from your diet, that's an advantage, because you have to spend less time actually eating. And that's we're going to talk about how that comes about later. Um, Looking at nutrition, um, is measured in calories, and then we have these things that we call the metabolic rate is the rate of energy consumption, which is the basal rate, which is what you just use to just have things run just normally, right? And there is a base metabolic rate um, that's actually surprisingly high, when you think about how little energy we use when we just run and stuff, um, because you're just keeping your body alive actually takes quite a bit of energy. Now, you need some essential nutrients. Essential, anytime you see the word essential in biology, it means that you need to supply this in the diet because your body cannot produce this. And so, one of those things, essential and amino acids, are this group of amino acids here. So, our body cannot produce these. And so, if you're a vegetarian, you need to make sure, if you eat meat, most of that is provided with meat. But if you're a vegetarian, you need to make sure that you have corn and legumes together in your diet, because methionine is something that you can only get with corn, and tryptophan and lysine you can only get from like beans and other legumes. Um, and what's really interesting to me is this kind of food, this bean and tortilla kind of thing, right? You have this in several cultures where you have this mixture of a vegetarian staple food that has just developed into a cultural thing that's what people eat, because it's worked, right? Um, the other things we need to include in a normal human diet are things like vitamins and minerals. We'll talk. Vitamins are coenzymes. So when you have a protein, and we're going to talk more about enzymes later. But sometimes these polypeptides contain small little pieces of organic molecules um, that help them function better, that make the function better. Um, Minerals are inorganic nutrients that are required in small amounts, um, and they require they're required for a number of different roles. You can see all of those things on your nutrition facts when you're looking at these, like your carbohydrates, your dietary fiber. All of those things are on there. Um, Watch out for serving sizes, because sometimes, like when you're looking at a ramen noodles, it's like 200 and some calories. Yes, well, except one thing of ramen noodles is two servings. So one thing of ramen noodles is actually like 400 calories, or even more than that. Um, Malnutrition is when somebody doesn't get the nutrition they need. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have enough food, right? They may have plenty of food, they just have the wrong kind of food. So they may miss something like an essential amino acid, or they may be missing vitamins or something like that. Um, and we do know that there is an influence between food and health, but it's a very, very complex um, type of relationship. And so um, everything in moderation probably is your best bet as far as a diet is concerned. And that's basically the big gist of what I wanted to go through with you in chapter 21.